February 1954, and the newlywed bride of America's greatest baseball hero was standing on a Korean War stage in a sequined gown while her husband of 3 weeks stared at an empty hotel bed in Tokyo. Marilyn Monroe had made a choice that night, a choice that would define not just her honeymoon, but the 8 remaining years of her life. When the military called, she could have said no. She could have stayed with Joe DiMaggio, explored Japan together, built the foundation of their marriage like normal couples do, but Marilyn wasn't a normal bride. And when she stepped off that military transport plane into the freezing Korean winter, when she heard that first thunderous wave of masculine desperation and adoration, she whispered to her assistant, "This is the first time I've ever felt like a real star." Back in the hotel, Joe was hearing those same words through a crackly phone line. And in that moment, he understood the terrible truth. He had married a woman who would always need more than one man could give. Korea wasn't just a USO tour, it was a revelation, and it would destroy them both. If you want to discover the untold stories behind Hollywood's most tragic love affairs, subscribe to this channel now, because what happened in Korea changed everything. January 14, 1954, San Francisco City Hall. Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio stood before a judge for exactly 14 minutes, exchanged vows that would last less than a year, and walked out as husband and wife into a media firestorm that neither of them was prepared for. The wedding was supposed to be secret, intimate, just the two of them escaping the Hollywood machine that had turned Marilyn into a commodity and Joe into a relic of baseball's golden age. But secrets don't exist when you're the most photographed woman in the world, married to the most famous athlete in American history. By the time they reached the airport for their honeymoon flight to Japan, 300 reporters were waiting, cameras flashing like artillery fire, questions screamed across the tarmac about whether Marilyn would retire from films, whether Joe would control her career, whether this marriage was real or just another publicity stunt manufactured by 20th Century Fox. Joe's jaw tightened with every question. Marilyn smiled that famous smile, the one that had sold 1 million magazines, and waved to the cameras like she was boarding a plane to paradise. But she wasn't going to paradise. She was going to Tokyo with a man who wanted her to disappear from public life, who dreamed of a quiet home in San Francisco where she would cook his dinners and raise his children and forget that she had ever been Marilyn Monroe. And she knew, even as that plane lifted off the runway, that she could never give him what he wanted. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a role she played, it was who she had become, cell by cell, spotlight by spotlight, until Norma Jean Baker was nothing but a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. The flight to Tokyo took 18 hours, and somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, Joe fell asleep with his head against the window, while Marilyn stared at her reflection in the dark glass and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She loved Joe, or at least she loved the idea of Joe, the strong, silent man who didn't want anything from her except her presence, who looked at her without calculation or hunger, who made her feel safe in a world that had never been safe. But love wasn't enough. It had never been enough, because beneath the love was a deeper need, a black hole of validation that no single person could ever fill. And she knew it, and Joe knew it, and neither of them wanted to admit it because admitting it meant accepting that their marriage was doomed before it even began. Tokyo welcomed them like visiting royalty. The Imperial Hotel suite was filled with flowers, champagne, gifts from Japanese dignitaries who wanted to meet the American goddess and her baseball hero husband. For 3 days, they played at being normal newlyweds, touring temples and gardens, eating at restaurants where Joe felt out of place among the foreign customs, and Marilyn charmed everyone with her broken Japanese and genuine curiosity. She was good at this, at being present, at making people feel like they were the only person in the world when she focused her attention on them. It was a survival skill she had learned as a child, bouncing between foster homes, the ability to become whatever people needed her to be, and it had served her well in Hollywood, where identity was currency and authenticity was a luxury no one could afford. But on the 4th night, everything changed. The phone call came at 9 p.m., after dinner, after Joe had ordered sake and was starting to relax for the first time since the wedding. Marilyn answered, listened for 30 seconds, and her entire body transformed. Joe watched it happen, watched her spine straighten and her eyes brighten, and that electric energy he both loved and feared surge back into her presence. When she hung up, she turned to him with an expression he had never seen before, something between exhilaration and apology, and said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "The military wants me to go to Korea to perform for the troops. They need me, Joe." Joe DiMaggio stared at his wife of 3 weeks and felt the ground shift beneath him. Korea. The war was technically over, an armistice signed 6 months earlier, but 60,000 American soldiers were still stationed there, occupying frozen positions along the 38th parallel, bored and homesick and desperate for any connection to the world they had left behind. And now the military wanted to send Marilyn Monroe into that testosterone-saturated war zone to sing and dance and remind these boys what they were supposedly fighting for. Joe's first instinct was to say no, absolutely not. We're on our honeymoon. You're my wife now, not the military's entertainment. But he looked at Marilyn's face and saw something that terrified him. A hunger so profound and desperate that he knew if he said no, if he tried to cage her, he would lose her anyway. So he said yes. Or rather, he said nothing, which Marilyn took as permission, and within 6 hours she was packed and ready to leave, coordinating with military handlers who materialized at their hotel like they had been waiting in the shadows all along. Joe watched her transform from his wife into Marilyn Monroe the entertainer, watched her select costumes and practice songs and discuss logistics with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. She kissed him goodbye at the airport with genuine affection, promised she would be back in 4 days, told him to enjoy Tokyo and she would make it up to him when she returned. And then she was gone, disappearing into a military transport plane that lifted off into the winter sky, leaving Joe standing on the tarmac, feeling like the loneliest man in the world. What Joe didn't know, couldn't know, was that Marilyn wasn't just going to Korea to entertain troops. She was going to Korea to prove something to herself, to answer a question that had been eating at her since the moment she said yes to Joe's marriage proposal. Could she be both Marilyn Monroe and Mrs. Joe DiMaggio, or would she have to choose? The marriage represented safety, stability, the kind of normal life that Norma Jean Baker had always dreamed of but never achieved. But Marilyn Monroe represented power, validation, proof that she mattered, that she was more than just a pretty face or a manufactured fantasy. And Korea would be the test, the moment where she would discover which identity was stronger, which need was deeper, which version of herself she could not live without. February 16, 1954, the temperature in Korea hovered around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze breath in the air, cold enough to make the soldiers huddled in their winter gear question why they were still in this God-forsaken country 6 months after the war supposedly ended. They had been told a special guest was coming, someone from Hollywood, but nobody believed it would actually be her, until the Jeep pulled up to the makeshift stage and Marilyn Monroe stepped out wearing a skin-tight purple sequin dress that defied every law of physics and common sense, and 100,000 men simultaneously lost their minds. The sound was unlike anything Marilyn had ever experienced. Not the polite applause of a movie premiere or the rehearsed enthusiasm of a studio audience, but a raw animal roar of need and gratitude and desperate masculinity that rolled across that frozen field like a physical force. She stood on that plywood stage, microphone in her trembling hand, and felt something inside her click into place, some essential piece of her identity that had always been missing suddenly made whole. These men didn't want her to be anyone's wife. They didn't want her to be small or domestic or safe. They wanted her to be exactly what she was, a goddess descended from Hollywood Olympus to remind them that beauty and desire and life still existed somewhere beyond the mud and boredom and threat of sudden violence. She sang "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend" first, and the crowd went insane, whistling and cheering and chanting her name like a prayer. Then, "Bye Bye Baby," her voice cracking from the cold and emotion, tears freezing on her cheeks as she realized this was what she had been searching for her entire life, this pure, uncomplicated worship, this validation that required nothing from her except her presence. She performed 10 songs that night, her fingers numb, her feet aching in high heels that were never designed for outdoor winter performances, and when she finally took her bow, when she blew kisses to that ocean of desperate, grateful faces, she whispered to herself the words that would eventually make their way back to Joe: "This is the first time I've ever felt like a real star." Back in Tokyo, Joe DiMaggio sat alone in their honeymoon suite and tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that this was just a temporary detour, that Marilyn would come back to him refreshed and ready to focus on their marriage. But he couldn't sleep. He paced the room, drank too much sake, stared at photographs of their wedding day, and tried to see some sign of what was coming. The hotel phone rang at 2 a.m. Tokyo time, and when he answered, he heard Marilyn's voice crackling across the long-distance connection, breathless and electric with an energy he recognized and dreaded. She told him about the performance, about the soldiers, about how incredible it felt to be needed like that, to be appreciated not as someone's wife or girlfriend or property, but as herself, fully and completely. And Joe listened, and made the appropriate responses and told her he was proud of her, while inside him something was dying, some hope he had been carrying, that maybe this time would be different, maybe this woman would be the one who chose him over everything else. Marilyn performed 10 shows over 4 days in Korea, each one in freezing temperatures that should have killed her, each one pushing her body beyond what it was designed to endure. She sang through bronchitis that would turn into pneumonia. She smiled through exhaustion that left her shaking. She signed autographs until her hand cramped and posed for photographs until the flash bulbs left permanent spots in her vision. And through it all she felt more alive than she had in years, more certain of her purpose, more confident in her identity. This was who she was supposed to be, not a housewife in San Francisco, but a performer, an icon, a fantasy made flesh that men would remember for the rest of their lives. The military handlers tried to protect her, to limit her exposure and conserve her energy, but Marilyn refused. She insisted on going to the most remote outposts, the camps where soldiers hadn't seen a woman in months, where the desperation was thickest and the gratitude most profound. She sat with injured men in medical tents and listened to their stories and held their hands and made them feel like heroes instead of casualties. She understood something that the military brass didn't, that these performances weren't just entertainment, they were therapy, they were validation, they were proof that someone back home remembered and cared and thought they mattered. And in giving that to them, she was also giving it to herself, confirming her own existence through their desire, proving her worth through their worship. On the final night, after her last performance at a base near the 38th parallel where the temperature had dropped to 5 degrees and her breath came out in frozen clouds, Marilyn collapsed in her dressing tent, her body finally surrendering to the pneumonia that had been building for days. The military doctor who examined her was horrified, told her she needed immediate hospitalization, that performing in these conditions with her symptoms was borderline suicidal. But Marilyn just laughed, that famous breathy laugh that made men's hearts stop, and said she had never felt better in her life. And she meant it. Because physical pain was nothing compared to the spiritual validation she had found on those stages, the proof that she mattered, that she was more than just another Hollywood blonde with a manufactured image and an expiration date. When she finally returned to Tokyo 5 days after leaving, Joe was waiting at the airport with flowers and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marilyn stepped off the plane wearing dark sunglasses to hide the illness and exhaustion, moving with the careful precision of someone who was running on nothing but willpower and prescription pills. Joe held her and told her he was glad she was back, and suggested they spend the next few days quietly recovering and reconnecting. But Marilyn had other plans. She wanted to tell him everything, to share every detail of her triumph, to make him understand what those 4 days had meant to her. And so she did, sitting in their hotel suite while Joe ordered room service and opened wine, talking for hours about the performances and the soldiers and the incredible energy, and how she had finally felt like a real star, not just a manufactured product but an artist with genuine power to move and inspire and transform. Joe listened. He nodded in the right places. He asked appropriate questions, but inside him something was calcifying, some understanding hardening into permanent truth. He had lost her. Maybe he had never really had her, because the woman sitting across from him glowing with exhaustion and triumph wasn't his wife. She was Marilyn Monroe, property of the world, and he was just another man in the audience, applauding and grateful for whatever scraps of attention she chose to give him. The pneumonia that Marilyn developed in Korea nearly killed her. By the time they returned to the United States in March, she was so sick that Joe had to carry her off the plane, and the photographs of him holding her limp body made front pages across the country. The official story was that she had sacrificed her health for the troops, a patriotic angel who gave everything for the boys in uniform. But the truth was more complicated and more tragic. Marilyn had sacrificed her health for herself, for the validation she needed like oxygen, for the proof that she mattered beyond being Joe DiMaggio's wife. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and Joe was there every day, sitting by her bed, holding her hand, playing the devoted husband for the nurses and doctors who whispered about what a lucky woman she was to have found such a man. But when Marilyn finally recovered enough to talk, when the antibiotics had cleared her lungs and the fever had broken, the first thing she said to Joe wasn't "thank you" or "I love you" or "I'm sorry." It was, "Did you see the photographs? Did you see how many men came to see me?" And Joe understood then that Korea hadn't been a detour or an interruption. It had been a revelation, a moment of clarity where Marilyn had discovered what she really wanted, and it wasn't him. The marriage would limp along for another 7 months, increasingly bitter and desperate, until Marilyn would file for divorce in October, citing mental cruelty. Joe would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what went wrong, trying to figure out if there was some moment where he could have made a different choice, said a different word, been a different man. But the truth was simpler and sadder than that. Korea hadn't destroyed their marriage. Korea had simply revealed what was already true, that Marilyn Monroe needed more than one man could ever give, and Joe DiMaggio needed more than Marilyn could ever be. Years later, after Marilyn's death, after Joe had spent 2 decades sending roses to her grave and mourning the woman he could never save, a reporter asked him about the Korea trip, about whether he resented those 4 days that had interrupted their honeymoon. Joe was quiet for a long time, staring out a window at nothing in particular, and then he said something that captured the entire tragedy of their relationship. "I wanted to be her whole world, but Marilyn's whole world was the whole world, and I was just one person in it." The Korea tour became part of Marilyn Monroe mythology, another chapter in the story of the tragic blonde goddess who gave everything for her art and her audience. But for the soldiers who were there, who stood in that freezing February cold and watched her perform in a sequined dress that should have been impossible, it was something more than mythology. It was a moment of grace, a reminder that beauty and joy and feminine energy still existed somewhere beyond the violence and tedium of military life. Many of those soldiers would carry the memory of that night for the rest of their lives, would tell their children and grandchildren about the time they saw Marilyn Monroe perform on a makeshift stage in Korea, would insist that she was even more beautiful in person than she was on film. And Marilyn, for her part, would always speak of Korea as one of the greatest experiences of her life, a moment when she felt truly seen and appreciated for who she really was. In interviews years later, even as her marriage to Joe crumbled and her mental health deteriorated and the studio system ground her down into nothing but a manufactured commodity, she would still light up when talking about those performances, about the energy of that crowd, about the feeling of being needed and wanted and valued. It was the closest she ever came to finding what she was looking for, that elusive sense of mattering, of being more than just a pretty face or a sex symbol or a blonde joke. For 4 days in Korea, she was a goddess, and 100,000 men worshipped at her altar. But worship has a cost. It feeds the ego while starving the soul. It confirms your importance while confirming your isolation. Because when you need the validation of crowds, when you need thousands of men screaming your name to feel real, how can one man ever be enough? How can one person's love compete with that kind of mass adoration? Joe DiMaggio learned this lesson in a Tokyo hotel room while his wife performed for an army. And Marilyn Monroe learned it over the remaining 8 years of her life, as she searched desperately for someone who could fill the void that Korea had revealed, someone who could make her feel like a real star while also making her feel like a real person. Neither of them ever found what they were looking for. Joe remarried, but never forgot Marilyn, spending decades mourning a marriage that was doomed from the start. And Marilyn spiraled deeper into the hunger that drove her to Korea, seeking validation in increasingly dangerous places, from increasingly dangerous men, until finally, on an August night in 1962, alone in her bedroom surrounded by empty pill bottles, she found the only peace she had ever known, the peace of silence. The peace of no longer needing to prove she mattered, the peace of finally mercifully being enough. So what really happened in Korea? What was the secret that both Joe and Marilyn carried with them for the rest of their lives? It wasn't about the performances or the soldiers or even the interrupted honeymoon. It was about the moment when two people looked at each other and saw the truth they had been avoiding since the day they met, that they wanted fundamentally incompatible things from life, and love alone couldn't bridge that gap. Joe wanted privacy, normalcy, a wife who would disappear from public view and build a quiet life with him. Marilyn wanted visibility, validation, proof that she existed beyond being someone's wife or daughter or fantasy. And Korea was the moment when those opposing needs became impossible to ignore. In the end, the Korea trip didn't destroy Joe and Marilyn's marriage. It simply accelerated what was already inevitable. Because you cannot build a life with someone who needs the world when all you want is a home. And you cannot find peace with someone who wants you to be small when your entire identity is built on being larger than life. Korea was the test that revealed the truth. And once that truth was visible, there was no going back, no pretending, no way to unsee what had been seen. 100,000 men roared Marilyn's name that night in Korea. One man sat in silence, 7,000 miles away, feeling his marriage die in real time, and neither of them could stop it. Because some choices once made can never be unmade, and some truths once revealed can never be hidden again. Korea wasn't just a USO tour, it was a revelation, and it would haunt both of them until the day they died.